I'm sure you would have seen what is happening in India. ED is on full roll and it is catching people left and right. In this video, I wanted to talk a little bit about this institution called Directorate of Enforcement. From where did it come? And most importantly, how really it gets this information. How suddenly, since 2014, after the advent of Modi government, this organization became so effective and powerful in India. Coming right up. So before we go into discussing how ED really gets information, how it works, let's get a little bit of its history. So before ED or Directorate of Enforcement came into effect, it was called Department of Economic Affairs, and it was built by Britishers especially to take care of foreign exchange and stuff like that. When India got its independence and the government was formed, this institution was renamed as Directorate of Enforcement or Enforcement Directorate, or ED as you see. The goal for this institution was still not focused on internal domestic money laundering. It was mostly focused on implementation of FERA, which was Foreign Exchange Regulation Act. So essentially, ED's work was to implement this law, which means that go out there, enforce this law, try to figure out if there was violation in foreign exchange management, and so on and so forth. So like this, it continued to run up until 2002. Now in 2003, when Atal Bihari Vajpayee government came in, they realized that the problem of money laundering was bigger domestically. It was while foreign exchange was important to be implemented, it was also important for the government to figure out how the money laundering was happening in domestic market. In lieu of that, PMLA, Prevention of Money Laundering Act of 2002, was enacted. Now this law became pivotal in establishing and giving powers to ED to act much more effectively. Now essentially, PMLA was primarily enacted for four important things. The first one was attachment. So essentially, it gave powers to ED to attach properties which were qualified as money laundering based. Number two was to identify proceeds of crime, which could be by people, by institutions, or whatnot. Number three was obviously money laundering, which means money which was acquired for one activity was used for another activity, and such and so forth. And number three was establishing a payment system. So essentially, the PMLA Act enabled India to kind of organize its domestic payment market, how money moved, how money was acquired, how money was transferred. In many ways, NPCI, UPI, and all this stuff which you see right now were indirect outcomes of PMLA. Anyhow, the responsibility of implementing this law and enforcing this law fell on the shoulders of ED. So essentially now ED was empowered by PMLA as well as FERA, which was a multi-decade-old law. Now, the only difference with PMLA was that it was much more stringent. It provided ED authority to go out there and arrest people by just telling them the reason. Now, organizationally, ED operates under Government of India, but it has 5 sub-branches in 5 cities of India. Now, one of the most important aspects of PMLA was that it was not ED which had to prove that this money was laundered. It was on the accused to prove that this was not laundered. And that kind of gave ED much more authority to execute on these cases. On top of that, because its jurisdiction was pan-India, it did not require any special privileges or special permissions from state governments to act. So this was the brief history of ED. You see, but even after this inaction, ED was not very effective. After the fall of NDA government and inaction of UPA government in 2003-04, ED did conduct a bunch of raids, but there were zero convictions. It was under huge pressure of the government. And most importantly, if you see, it did not have any tools or resources to really identify these transactions which were happening between people, especially when they are cash transactions, especially when there's no infrastructure which was put around for regulating money movement. So the 10 years of UPA government, while ED continued to process or continued to do its work, it was not really effective because of obvious reasons. And also there was a little bit of a lack of conviction when it comes to the government resources. And that all contributed to the fact that ED just became one of the other institutions operating under the government, which just carried on their work as they had. Now, after the advent of Modi government, everything changed. The first most important step that the government took was Jan Dhan. It wanted everybody in the country to participate in India's fiscal system. So more than 20 crore people in India who were unbanked got bank accounts. And on top of that, the second most important step taken was demonetization. Demonetization put India on path of digitization for money movement. Whether it was a transaction worth 5 rupees or 5 lakh rupees, everything was carried out in real time on digital rails. This made the job of ED much more easier. And that's why you see since 2017 up until now, in the last 5 years, ED has conducted much more raids than what it did in the last 14 years, including the first 10 years of UPA government. And not only this, it attached more than $20 billion in overall properties and achieved conviction in more than 35 different cases. So how does ED work now? Essentially, if you see, ED has 3 different sources of information. The first source is obviously the government. All these institutions which fall under government, whether it is State Bank or other PSUs, whether it is the money movement system, these institutions provide information to Enforcement Directorate when they see anomalies in transactions or money movement. For example, say if you usually deposit $5,000 a month in your account and suddenly there comes 50 lakh rupees in your account, that transaction is flagged and is put into a database which is then later analyzed. And also in the same fashion, if you are withdrawing a lot of money from your account all of a sudden without a history of that will also be flagged. So the first set of information comes from the established institutions. The second pillar of information is the informer network. You see, because of digitization and connectivity between people, processes, and offices, it's easier for ED to put its informers across the board in different cities, in different channels, to acquire information which is then used to triangulate these transactions and figure out who could be involved in where. The last and the most important thing from where ED gets this information is analytics. See, out of all these direct decisions which this government has taken, there has been few important decisions taken on enabling or equipping its agencies with technology. Almost all the institutions are using deep learning, machine learning, data analytics to semantically map all the information which comes to them, to triangulate and map and find out not only probability of where money laundering is happening, but also predicting where the probability of money laundering is very high. One such example is the recent SSC scam, which has been highlighted in West Bengal. While it actually started based on the judicial probe High Court institutionalized, over the years, over the months, there has been tons and tons of data analyzed to build up this case. So if you look at the effectiveness of ED and why they are able to sense where the money is kept, it is all because of this triangulation which is happening between the information it is getting from these 3 sources. So the most important thing to understand here is in the last 6 years, all these institutions, whether it is CBI, whether it is NIA, whether it is ED, CAG, they have got much more empowerment from the government to act more and more independently, which has resulted is much more effectiveness. And it is visible across the board, whether it is confiscation of the properties of defaulters, whether it is conviction rates in different cases of ED, or whether it's effectiveness of CBI across the board. And this is what is creating a panic amongst the people who are really involved in this kind of situation. I hope it continues like this, because unless there's fear amongst the criminals, such crimes continue to happen, because back in the days there was no conviction, people were not jailed. And looks like the things are changing. So with that, I will end this video. See you in the next one. Stay safe, stay happy.